Hello, Paul Osborne here. Thank you for downloading this latest podcast. The bigger numbers get, the harder they are to comprehend. You know what £10 is, or £100, or £1,000, but what about £1 million? Or £1 billion? Can you even conceive of that? It's hard to quantify. Similarly, one death is a tragedy that we can all identify with. Most of us have lost someone we were close to. 10 deaths is unusual, but still 10 individuals whose names we can learn, whose families we can empathise with. But 100,000 deaths, how do you comprehend that? It's a figure that in some ways is incalculable. How do you turn that abstract number into 100,000 people? Their faces, their lives, their families, their friends. 100,000 people who were alive a year ago, with no idea of what was about to happen. Officially, we passed this awful threshold this week, at least according to the government's measure of deaths within 28 days of a positive coronavirus test. In terms of the number of death certificates that mentioned COVID, we passed 100,000 earlier in January. Either way, it is a grim, miserable point in this grim, miserable pandemic. Back in March, the health and scientific officers whose faces we're now so used to seeing told us that a good outcome would be to limit deaths to 20,000. We passed that figure by the middle of the following month.
I am deeply sorry for every life that has been lost, and of course, as Prime Minister, I take full responsibility for everything that the government has done. What I can tell you is that we truly did everything we could and continue to do everything that we can to minimise loss of life and to minimise suffering in what has been a very, very difficult stage and a very, very difficult crisis for our country.
No doubt, Boris Johnson had a shell-shocked look about him as he confirmed the 100,000 deaths, and no one doubts this is a crisis that would have tested any government of any political makeup. It is a once-in-a-century crisis, but while the horror of it has been unimaginable, in some ways it was predictable. But how many times were we told that we were overdue the next global pandemic, that we should give more thought and attention to preparing for it? And yet when that crisis did come, as we were told it would, we seemed shockingly underprepared and at times astonishingly complacent. Not just the Prime Minister's casual handshaking with COVID patients, but all the warning signs from around the world that we appeared to ignore. A year ago, it was still the occasional cruise ship in quarantine. Then Italy's healthcare system collapsed, but we were told it couldn't happen here. Cases started to rise, and a handful of experts went public with calls for a lockdown, but all the government did was ask us to steer clear of pubs if it wasn't too much trouble. We locked down too late. One of the government's own disease modelers says more than 20,000 lives could have been saved if we'd brought the restrictions in just 1 week earlier. And then we opened up too soon. As case numbers fell away in the summer, we were told to eat out to help out. This was not a scheme to help the struggling hospitality sector, because if it was, it would have included takeaways. This was a bribe to coax us out of the homes we'd got too used to being in, to get us back into bars and restaurants, to get us back into spending money again. Factor in the pressure on many people to return to the workplace and the mass movement of students across the country in the autumn, and the seeds of the second wave are, in retrospect, pretty obvious. Now, look, no one could have foreseen the devastating impact of the highly infectious variant that then emerged in Kent, but by then we'd already made so many mistakes. We abandoned mass testing early in the first wave, but then were told later that it was pivotal to beating the pandemic. Test and trace was an embarrassing private sector failure. Phone apps were trial, but they never seemed to work properly. PPE was thin on the ground, and the contracts to mass produce it often seemed to be handed out to people who had surprisingly close links to the Conservative Party, and yet who wouldn't recognise PPE if it chased them down the street, calling them shameless ghouls cashing in on tragedy. And all the time, planes kept flying in and out of Heathrow Airport, and only now are we thinking about quarantining the people who get off them. Of course, London's status as a global hub, its international population, its densely packed population, all contributed to the spread. But surely the UK's island nation status should have helped us. Australia has reported fewer deaths across the whole of this pandemic than the UK usually reports in a single day. Just over 900 so far, and fewer than 30,000 infections. But here, 1 in 50 of those over the age of 85 has died, and 1 in 100 of those over 75. The figures will tell you that 96% of those who have died with COVID so far had a pre-existing condition, and it's very tempting to take solace from that. Only the already ill are at risk. Well, firstly, that obviously isn't true. And secondly, how many people do you know who have a pre-existing condition? And how would you feel if they died? What if it was you? It doesn't actually take that much to find that you've been listed as having a pre-existing condition. Some lockdown skeptics have at times used language that appeared to imply that those lives were in some way worth less. They were lives that could justifiably be sacrificed to preserve the lives of the rest of us, the ones that have been put on hold now for the best part of the year. Now, maybe they'll say that that's not what they meant, but to a lot of people, that's what it sounded like. And even now, after all this death, you can find MPs who will demand faster and further reaching relaxation of the restrictions, not just because of the entirely justifiable fears about what this lockdown is doing to a generation of children, but often out of a desire to get the economy moving, even if the price of that is more lives lost. One day there'll be an inquiry into all of this. The failings will be identified, and those responsible will be called to account. But none of them will have any power by the time the report's published, and it won't really bring any comfort for the friends or relatives of the 100,000 to die, so far at least. Of course, one area where we really are ahead of most other countries is in vaccine distribution. Even here, we're carrying out our own sort of drug trial, lengthening the gap between doses beyond what the manufacturers would recommend. But we have vaccinated around 7 million people in a month, and that is extraordinary. Imagine how much more extraordinary it would have been if we'd been able to vaccinate most of those 100,000 victims rather than bury them. That's it for now. There's more, as ever, on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at Party Games Pod. There's an archive of all the past episodes at partygamespodcast.com. Until next time, though, thank you for listening and goodbye.